All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's now bring in John Irons of the Economic Policy Institute for his reaction to what we just heard from the co-chairman of the President's Budget Deficit Reduction Commission. They were talking with our Peter Cook. EPI, by the way, is a liberal-leaning nonprofit think tank. Early this week, it released an alternative budget blueprint developed jointly with Demos and the Century Foundation. John, good to have you here with us. I know you caught some of the conversation that our Peter Cook had with the two co-chairmen of the commission, but you've been following this story. What's wrong in terms of what they're proposing in your view?
Well, I think they're being fairly optimistic about how well their plan might be received. I think there's a lot of problems with this proposal, with the Bowles-Simpson proposal. In my mind, the biggest problem is that it doesn't really recognize the immediate economic crisis that we're in. They say nothing about immediate job creation and really start to book in austerity starting in only 10 months in fiscal year 2012. So I think they're coming at this from a perspective that doesn't really acknowledge the pain people are going through today.
What specifically in terms of job creation? Because I know you talk about that a lot. I mean, what is it that you would want to see that you think would have a bigger impact on really reducing the deficit and at the same time getting people back to work?
Well, I do think that reducing the deficit is good for the long term. It's just that in the immediate term, we do need more money for job creation. And in the plan that we've put forward, we book in some money initially for job creation and also sustain investments over time. And I think this can mean anything from infrastructure to increases in aid to state governments. And I think the standard mix of job creation activities that were part of the first recovery package could be done to a greater extent to really create jobs now.
I wonder about, the idea of taking away loopholes and then obviously getting more money by doing that, but also lowering rates. Is that an attractive idea to you if it were actually plausible to do with this electorate?
Well, I think the commission is actually right, and the Bowles-Simpson plan does address tax expenditures. This is nearly $1 trillion worth of preferences and deductions and credits in the tax code. And so really taking a hard look at those deductions, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. Now, I think it's an interesting question about whether or not you want to use all of that revenue to lower rates. And given that we have this huge deficit problem in the out years, I think we should look carefully at how much of the revenue we simply recycle back in terms of lower rates. We do know that the tax code is somewhat imbalanced with a lot of the Bush-era tax changes going to people at the very top. And so I think what we really need to do is look at rebalancing the tax code, maybe raising some rates on people at the very top of the income spectrum, at the same time taking care of a lot of these tax expenditures. So I appreciate where they're coming from and trying to limit these things. I think that's very important to do. But to simply do that in the context of lowering rates, I don't think makes sense as part of a deficit commission.
The concern, though, John, isn't the concern that, these kind of things hit the middle class hard, right? The mortgage interest deduction is something that middle class workers really rely on to hold their taxes down. And of course, the wealthier Americans are able to use that deduction to really bring their taxes down.
That's right, and I think the right approach here is to look at limiting the value of these tax deductions. So right now, if you're in a 35% tax bracket, you get 35 cents on the dollar. If you're an average American in the middle of the tax bracket, you might be paying 15 cents on the dollar, and so you don't get as big of a tax break. And so perhaps the right approach is to limit the value of these deductions to something like 15%, so that if you're in the middle income, you're not really impacted by that kind of limitation, whereas if you're very wealthy and really can use these to game the system, you wouldn't be able to do that to the same extent.
Let me ask, Carol described your think tank, EPI, as a liberal-leaning nonprofit think tank, but what do you think about the supply side? Isn't it important? I mean, if you cut rates, isn't that a good way to spur growth and then help to create jobs and reduce the deficit?
Well, I think a couple things. One is if you cut rates, you're not going to reduce the deficit. That will be a net cost to the federal government. There's plenty of evidence that shows that. Right now, the problem is really the demand side. So if we're looking for stimulus, the rate reductions are simply not going to do that. Can the tax code be made better? Absolutely. And we, again, should look at the tax expenditure side of things. And over the long term, looking at things like reducing spending by the Department of Defense, looking at increasing revenue, I think is the best way to think about reducing the deficit. And over the very long term, it's really all about health care costs, and so that needs to be addressed.
Well, that's a good point. You know what I think is missing, and maybe I just missed it in this conversation, but we've got really, really big government. I mean, when do we really kind of look at what we've built at this point and think about what we can get rid of. I mean, doesn't that need to be addressed significantly? I know we're talking about tax cuts and all this other stuff and creating demand. I get it. But the government has gotten so big. Matt and I talk about the educational department, how much is spent. It obviously isn't as productive as it should be. When do we start attacking big government?
Actually, if you look at how much the government actually spends as a share of the economy, which is the right way to look at it, it really isn't much larger as a share of the economy than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I think it's a myth that government spending is in some generic way out of control. Yes, the government does spend money on things that are not very effective, but the overall levels are not that out of whack with where we've been historically, nor the out of whack with the rest of the world. And so when you look at how government spending has fared over the past 20, 30 years, especially on an area I think that the Simpson report really tries to crack down on, which is the annual appropriations, they're bringing those level of spendings down to levels that we just haven't seen in the past 30 or 40 years, levels that are 50% lower than they were, even during Ronald Reagan. So they're really, driving down spending on some of these domestic investments to really record low levels. It's simply not the case that spending in some generic ways out of control.
So you think that spending is not out of control? So the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq didn't cost us too much. Entitlement spending is nothing to worry about. You think that spending is just fine right here?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that when you look at what we're asking our federal government to do in terms of public investments, as well as spending on health care, which Medicare is one of the most popular programs out there. It really does prevent a lot of elderly people from having to go into financial ruin because they get sick. And so what we need to ask is, what are we asking our government to do, and make sure we pay for it. And so when you look at the deficit situation, those need to be the questions. I think this commission and all the efforts around deficit reduction need to ask the questions that you're asking. What are we asking the government to do? And not beat up on spending in a generic way. We need to say, what can we do to control healthcare costs economy-wide, not just with the government? And how can we most effectively spend our scarce tax dollars? And so we need to look at program area by program area. And from our perspective, we need to really increase public investment so we have a strong economy. We need to have enough jobs going forward so we can afford to pay off the deficit in the future. And that's the number one priority.
Certainly going to be a key priority in an ongoing discussion. John, thank you so much. John Irons of the Economic Policy Institute.